Hi everyone and welcome to the first lecture of the semester. Today we're going over the Waldman readings chapters 1 through 3, and what I like doing in these lectures is really focusing on the aspects of the readings that I think are most pertinent for the goals of the course, but also what I think is really helpful in terms of writing your final paper. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the main thing you should think about when it comes to research methods is that the entirety of building a good research project is finding the right tools, and all these different methods and methodologies, and we'll go over the differences between those two things. All of it comes down to finding the right tool for a job, right? Like if you needed a hammer, if you needed to put a nail into a piece of wood, the most common tool you're probably going to use is some sort of hammer, right? You could probably get it done if you grabbed a wrench and just smacked it the right way, but it's not going to be perfect for what you're trying to accomplish. And you can kind of take that same thinking into research, right? Whether you are trying to, when you want to use interviews, when you want to use surveys, when you want to use ethnographies, which is something we'll go over a little bit later in the semester as well. All of those are going to be determined by what the goal of your research project is, right? There are different techniques, there's different things to think about when doing research, and different types of inquiry require different types of tools, right? Like I said, depending on the project, depending on what your goals are, that's going to determine what tools you're going to be using and what research methods you should be using, right? So if you use the right methods for your research, you can convince others that your conclusions have sound validity or have some validity, right? So that's new knowledge that is soundly based, right? That's all. That's the main thing people are looking for, is making sure that your the conclusions that you reach, whether you prove something, you disprove something, that at the end that they're valid results, and a lot of that is going to be determined on what tools and research methods you choose. Now, what can you do with research? And this is also helpful to think about in terms of when you're thinking about your own project and what you're going to be deciding what you want to focus on. You can kind of use some of these aims to figure out what direction you want to go, right? You can categorize something, right? Forming some sort of typology, a set of names that can be sorted. You can describe something, right? Examine situations in order to establish what is a norm. And more importantly, once you figure out what that norm is, you can figure out what's to be expected. And so if something is not fitting what is to be expected or predicted under some similar circumstances, that's also something that you can then prove within your research. You can explain something, right? So whether it's making sense of whether it's human interaction, political conversations or dialogue, whether it's cultural norms, whatever kind of contextual information there is, but there's a lot of different ways that you can make sense of and explain things using research. You can evaluate, right? So you make judgments about the quality of objects or events. You can compare things, right? Highlight the differences and similarities, and that often leads to a better understanding of a particular phenomenon, right? If you're trying to compare something, trying to figure out the differences between college basketball athletes in the Midwest versus in the Southwest, there are a lot of different ways that you can approach that type of study, but in the end, you can figure out what those differences and what those similarities are. And again, because it's different subjects, because maybe you're coming at it from a different way, those types of research projects could be wildly different, right? I like using that example of trying to figure out because a lot of my background, the other class I teach in this program is sports leadership. I've come across a lot of folks who are trying to understand, college athletes and what's going on in terms of beliefs and understandings. And there's different ways that you can approach that, right? If you wanted to, you could get a survey and send it out to thousands of college athletes, and then you can use a quantitative program to kind of make sense of those things. Or if you wanted to, you could do an ethnography where, when you think of ethnography, just think of observation, where you could have someone who is going to NMSU. They get approval from the university, approval from the athletics department, approval from the coaches and the players, and they basically just observe the team for an entire season, right? You're at the heart of it. Both of those projects are looking at college athletes, and specifically college basketball. Let's use that as an example. But those are two wildly different approaches, and you're going to get two wildly different sets of data from conducting research in those ways. But that's also gives you that ability to compare and contrast, right? If someone did a particular research one way, you can then use a different method and do a comparative study that way. You can correlate, right? And this one's a big one, where you want to see whether or how two phenomena influence each other and trying to really figure out, right? And you're going to hear this throughout the semester. You probably heard it before, right? Figuring out if correlation equals causation. I believe it's going to be in the Whelan book, where they talk about the fact that they did a study and apparently ice cream sales and murders both go up in the summertime. Now, just because there's correlation doesn't mean it's causation, right? Most likely it just means that, well, in the summer months, people are wanting to cool down, and so they're eating ice cream. And at the same time, in the wintertime, it's pretty cold, and some people who don't have access to proper heating, to proper clothing, they're less likely to be outside during the wintertime. So in the summertime, they're more likely to commit crime. So correlation is really important. It's like I said, it's a big part of, or it's a very commonly used goal for research. What else can you do? You can predict things, right? So you can use correlations, descriptions. You can predict what happens under predictable circumstances, and that's again where we get the validity aspect and the reliability of a particular project. Trying to figure out if you can predict something based on all the information you previously have. You can control something. Once you get enough information, right, you can understand an event or a situation, you may be able to figure out a way to control it. Now, there's all these different things that you could try to do as in terms of like the aim of your particular project. But what you need to do right now, what a lot of us are in the process of figuring out, is deciding on your type of research. I myself am in the process of putting a research project together on my own. So I feel for you in terms of like being in that initial stage and trying to figure out exactly what I want to do and how I want to do it. So your research interests are going to decide the nature of your research problem, right? Really figure, and then that's why I always tell my students, whether it's my undergrad students or my graduate students, when they're in my class, I want you all to choose something that you're passionate about for your papers, right? I like giving you all that flexibility because if you are interested in that particular subject matter, you're more likely to put more effort into it. You're more likely to be more excited about it. All that being said, that interest is going to drive what your research problem is. From there, your research problem is going to indicate the type of research you want to follow, and that's where we get into the literature review. What I like doing in my literature review, and I think I put this or I mentioned this in the intro video, is not trying to reinvent the wheel. If there's someone who's already at least laid some groundwork for a similar study or someone that I admire who I think this work is almost exactly something that I want to be doing, I can borrow from some of the things that they've already done to kind of build some structure into my own project. And that will then shape your research design, right? Whatever research you figured out that you think is going to work for you, whether you're borrowing from someone else or whether you're coming up with something on your own, that's going to start shaping your research design. And keep in mind, you can have multiple types of research design. I know most folks kind of split it up between quantitative and qualitative, but there's also mixed methods. And some folks like using a variety of different methods when it comes to their research project, right? It could be a combination of interviews and ethnographies. It could be a combination of surveys and interviews. There are a number of different things that you can do in a number of different ways that you can really try to answer some of your research questions or prove or disprove some of your hypotheses. Now, this is actually part of, or this will be, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, part of your discussion board for this week. Is inductive and deductive reasoning. So these are some of the common things people consider in terms of when they start thinking about research projects and how they're approaching their own particular research projects. So if you're using inductive reasoning, you're starting from a very specific observation or sensory experience and developing a conclusion from them. So here's this example. So all giraffes that I have seen have very long necks. That's a repeated observation. So therefore I conclude that all giraffes have long necks. And that's your conclusion, right? You can see the line of thinking when it comes to inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a little bit different, right? From there, you begin with a general statement or a premise, and through logical argument, come to a very specific conclusion. So all living things will eventually die. That's a general statement, and that's your first premise. From there, you say this animal is a living thing. That's your inference, and that's your second premise. And then from there, you go, therefore, this animal will eventually die, and that's your conclusion. Right, so you can see there are differences between those two types of reasoning. And that's a good way of starting kind of the initial steps of how you're approaching whatever problem, statement, or hypotheses that you're trying to build up for your project. Now, I did pull this from the textbook, but I think this gives you a generally good idea of what a research process might look like, right? So reviewing your subject area, you can see all the different ways, all the different arrows that it points you through, looking at some of the ethical issues that are involved, gaining approval to continue. That's not necessarily a step you'll have to go through for me. I will be looking online. I think it is in week 3 where I'm asking you for what your research project might be, or to share some ideas on that. But generally, if you're in academia already, depending on what your research project is, and if you're going to be dealing with humans, you do have to get approval. You have to write a whole proposal out. You go to the IRB, and I think I mentioned this in our intro video. And you have to get approval before you can move forward, because they want to make sure you're not endangering anybody. Once you get approval, you can see the rest of the process as it's drawn out here in this graph. But I wanted to give you a general idea of what that looks like. Now, in terms of the research process, there's also some elements I want to go over, and not all of these will be a part of your research project depending on what you decide to do. Now, all of them are going to have some sort of conclusion, and all of them include some sort of operationalization, but some folks decide whether they want to do an hypothesis, whether they want to have some premises. All of that's going to be determined by how you decide to do your project. So a hypothesis, I think we've all understand that idea of like, it is what we think is going to happen based on everything that we already know, maybe some of the preliminary research that we've done. This is what we think is going to happen, and that's your hypothesis, and your entire research project is then figuring out if you were right, proving it right, or proving it wrong. Usually when it comes to like the other option, I forgot to put that here, is research questions, right? Sometimes you're not doing a hypothesis, you have a research question instead, or multiple research questions that you're trying to answer through your project. Now, usually with your hypothesis, you have some premises which lead to your hypothesis. Like, here's premise 1, here's premise 2, like we saw with the deductive reasoning. And so because of that, here is my hypothesis of what's going to happen, right? So that's how the hypothesis and the premises are kind of linked together. But instead of those, you could have research questions. Now, when it comes to operationalization, I like thinking about it this way. Let's say you were trying to figure out through your research what effect affection has on children in terms of their development and their self-confidence, or something like that, right? Well, you as a researcher have to then define what affection is going to look like, right? It's going to be something different for everybody, but for the purposes of your research, you have to operationalize your specific idea of affection. So you might define it by words of affirmation, you might define it by physical touch like hugging, but it's completely up to you to provide that definition. That's just one small example, but you have to do that throughout your project when it comes to using certain terms that you're going to be using throughout the proposal. And lastly, of course, you're going to have some sort of conclusion once you finish the actual project. You won't have those for your proposal, but when it comes to a research project, you will have conclusions. The last thing I want to do with this lecture is give you some questions that I think will help start kind of getting the wheels turning in terms of what your final project is going to be, because these 8 weeks are going to fly by, and I think it's better to start thinking about that now. So what are you going to do, right? Figuring out what the main subject matter is that you want to really focus in on, right? That's the big question to start with. From there, why are you going to do it? What is the process? What is the reason behind that? How are you going to do that? And that's when we start getting into the method part of it, right? Qualitative, quantitative, what specific methods are you going to be using? And then when are you going to do it, right? So hypothetically, if this was like a dissertation, you'd have to provide a timeline to your committee of like, here's when the proposal is going to be due. Here's when I'm sending this to IRB. From here, this is when I'm going to start working on the XYZ. This is when I'm going to start handing out surveys. This is when I'm going to start running the data through this program. You provide some sort of timeline. Now, that's not necessarily something that is a part of our proposal, but I still think it's helpful to think about, to kind of put some parameters on your thinking in terms of if this was something you were actually going to do, how long do you think it would take to do a project of that magnitude, right? So these questions I think will be helpful, especially the first 3, in figuring out what your project is going to be. But overall, like I said, for this first lecture, I really just wanted to focus on some of the main parts from the readings and the parts that I think are really helpful in terms of thinking about research, your approach to research, and more importantly, what you'll be doing for your final paper.